Welcome to the DataOps product overview of the DataKitchen platform. My name is Gil Ben-Ghiat, and I'm one of the founders of DataKitchen. Let's start with a brief introduction. Customers using our DataKitchen platform are able to deliver previously unavailable business insights by developing and deploying innovative data and analytic pipelines through iteration rapidly. Our customers use us in four main ways: to orchestrate a complex data pipeline, while that pipeline is running, to automate tests and monitor data quality so they could keep trust with their customers. Once that pipeline is running, somebody inevitably has a new idea and wants to make a change. We support that process, that iterative process, and we help them through number three, creating analytic environments in which to work, also known as sandboxes. And finally, once everything is working in that environment and all tests pass, we help deploy those new ideas into production. So let's take a look at our platform through a couple of scenarios. And there's two scenarios we're going to go through, one in this chapter, one in the next. The first one, which we'll cover next, is I don't want to learn about data quality issues from my customers. We'll focus on product orchestration, monitoring, and the environment that we'll look on is an on-premise SQL Server data warehouse environment. In the next video, we'll focus on part two, which will show the cloud platform. All right, let's take a look at our software. There are three ways our customers interact with our software. One is through a command line, two is through an API, and probably most common is through this web interface. And I'll start off by logging on. There's a few components I'd like to go over before we get into a lot of detail. I'd like to talk about kitchens, recipes, and orders. So first, kitchens, and we see a list of them here, are a place to work. Kitchens are also known as a sandbox, and they consist of a code branch plus hardware. They also play a role in deployment. Let's go into one of the kitchens and take a look. Here we see this is where recipes and orders are available. So recipes is a data pipeline which orchestrates a number of components and also contains tests. Once a pet recipe runs, it's called an order, and the results of that recipe run include test timing, test results, recipe timing, and in general, it's data about your operations. These also include statistical process control graphs. In this training, we won't get into ingredients, which are recipes for reuse, secrets, which is managing the credentials for your infrastructure, and here is history, because we do, since we are working with a branching system, it's a way to see the history of work. Okay, so let's look at a particular recipe. We'll look at this one called warehouse, and look at this one called production update scheduled. And we can see it's a simple four-step recipe. I'll put it on the screen this way, it's a little easier to see. And we see it's working on SQL Server. And what are those four steps? Well, it's taking data that's loaded in Amazon S3. It's copying it to the Windows server. It's then fixing up that data with Python, loading it into SQL Server with SSIS, and finally, we're checking the data in Microsoft SQL Server. And as you notice, there's four different technologies in here: PowerScript, Python, SSIS, and then SQL. Later on, we'll take a look and see how to set up each of those. To save some time, I've run this recipe previously, and let's take a look at those runs. And before I go on, remember, this is an example of orchestration of four different tools. So let's see what's previously run, and we can see that there has been an error in the order run. So let's go in and take a little closer look. So we see some timing and information about the run, And we could see things are looking okay. We see green, 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 and then there was some error in check data in SQL Server. So to diagnose this, I'd look in one of two places. Was it a test that failed, or was it something that didn't work from one of these technologies? So let's actually start by looking at the logs. And we can see in here that there's some information from each of the 4 different technologies. Some output from the PowerScript, output from the Python, output from the SSIS job, and output from the SQL. And at the end here, we could see that, that it was actually a test that failed. There's also a way you could get a quick look by filtering. If we just say, let's filter everything out and just look at the errors, we can see that yes, we could really zoom on it quite quickly. So let's take a look at the test results. In this particular recipe, there's different steps and they have different tests that run. And here we could see that there was a failure, that a particular row count wasn't as large as it should be expected. And we'll go take a look at that. As long as we're looking at the order runs, let's look at a few other things. We collect data about the order runs over time. And here are, the recipe contains, the simple recipe contains just 3 tests. And here are the values of the runs. And we could look at this, and this is really a statistical process control graph, where here are the values from each run, and we could see it varies over time. This black line is the control, and we could see a few times we got 0, which in this case was a warning. We also collect timing information about the runs, and we could see that it usually takes about the same amount of time. We display each of those steps in a Gantt chart. Since it's linear, it's not as useful as if it were a more complex chart. Then the critical path would definitely pop. And here we could just see what the longest step is. And it seems like run by run, the getting data from S3 to the Windows server is always the longest step. All right, so how do you set up this graph? Let's go back and take a look at the recipe. All right, so let's start with the test that failed. And it happened in this last step here, check data in SQL Server. So we have a variety of ways to orchestrate technologies. In this particular step, it's about sending SQL into Microsoft SQL Server. And here there's a few ways that we can interact with that step. This is the form view. We see that there's sub-steps called keys and tests. If we take a look at the test that failed, the order rows, we can see that there was an action of stop on error. We also have the option to issue a warning or to log the value. And the actual test is right here, that it should be greater than 8,500. We can also, if you prefer, look at this at source view, because what the form is doing is actually producing a JSON file. And we can see the test right here of raw order rows and simply compare it to a hard-coded number. This could be parameterized. This could be, there's different variables that could participate. Also up here, we can see that this step contains a few things. There's a snippet of SQL that's run, and that's what a test consists of, a snippet of code and then the actual logic. And then in other places, you can have this snippet of SQL do some actual work. Here it's just collecting data for tests, but it could actually do some transformations. And the code could appear here in line, or it could appear in a resource file. And let's just take a quick look at what that file looks like. So we see it could be arbitrarily complex, the work that's done, the test that's written, and we can see that it could be parameterized to either get its data from get its data from different places or to put its data in different places. All right, let's conclude this section by looking at a Python node. So we'll go back to the recipe. Here's fixed data with Python. And what do we see here? Well, there's a Python snippet that we run. What this does, it takes the data, reads it in, adds a column with a little bit of information, and writes it out before it's written into the SQL Server database. And how do you configure that? It's relatively straightforward. We're using a method here where we say, for this particular machine, with this username and password, take the file that's in source control, so you know you're always getting the latest one, put it in this directory, and run this command. And here we're using the winrm method. We also support SSH for Linux machines. And actually, let's see what the file looks like if we fill in the parameters. We can see that the host name here resolves to this, but here we can see that the username and password, which are credentials, are stored in the vault, and that's how we manage our secrets. So just taking a look at the recipe one more time, we have a variety of ways to call things. These three nodes have a similar pattern of using winrm. This one is sending in SQL Server. We orchestrate the pieces and we store the results here where the administrator can then fix things or collect info on the data. And finally, if there's an error, you don't have to keep checking back on the screen. We also send emails which can also be turned into Slack messages or text messages to be notified if something goes wrong. All right, that concludes part one of the demo. Part two will be next.